Robert Smalls was born on April 5, 1839, in Beaufort, South Carolina, in a slave cabin behind the house at 511 Prince Street. His mother was Lydia Polite, an enslaved woman owned by Henry McKee, a local planter who may very well have been Robert's father. That detail matters because it explains certain privileges Robert received as a child, privileges that would shape his future in ways neither he nor his mother could have predicted. He grew up in the house rather than the fields, learned to speak standard English rather than only Gula, and was taught to carry himself in ways that would allow him to move through white society. But Lydia Polite understood something crucial about raising an enslaved child who received preferential treatment. She understood that comfort could become complicity, that a house slave who forgot about field slaves was a slave nonetheless. So Lydia made deliberate choices. She had grown up in the fields herself before being brought to work in the McKee house, and she refused to let her son remain ignorant of what slavery actually meant for most people. She took young Robert to the Beaufort jail yard and made him watch the public whippings of enslaved people. She brought him to slave auctions in town and made him witness human beings, including children, bought and sold like livestock. She had been ripped from her own family at age 9, and she was determined that her son would understand the system that claimed to own them both. Robert later testified before the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission in 1863 that although he had no personal complaints against Henry McKee, he had indeed seen enslaved people whipped and placed in heavy irons. He said something else that revealed what his mother had taught him. He said that although he was born a slave, he always felt that he was a man and ought to be free, and that he would be free or die. That kind of certainty doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a mother who understood that the difference between a human being and property was a legal fiction, and that fictions could be challenged. Robert absorbed these lessons. He became defiant, getting himself thrown into the Beaufort jail more than once for his attitude. His mother, fearing for his safety in a small town where everyone knew everyone's slaves, made arrangements with Henry McKee. In 1851, when Robert was 12 years old, McKee sent him to Charleston to be hired out as a laborer. The arrangement was simple and brutal. Robert would work various jobs in the city, earning wages that legally belonged to Henry McKee. Robert was permitted to keep $1 per week for himself. Everything else went back to his master. It was slavery with a wage slip attached, a reminder that even his labor, even his time, even his exhaustion at the end of a workday belonged to someone else. But Charleston did something for Robert that Beaufort never could have. The city was South Carolina's busiest port, a place where ships from around the world docked and departed, where cargo was loaded and unloaded, where the rhythm of the tides dictated the rhythm of commerce. Robert found work first as a hotel waiter, then as a lamplighter walking Charleston's streets at night. But it was the waterfront that captured him. As a teenager, he began working on the docks and wharves, learning the skills of sailmaking, rigging, and eventually piloting. He took to the water, as people later said, like he'd been born to it. He learned every channel, every sandbar, every current in Charleston Harbor. He learned how to read the water the way other people read books. And he learned something else just as important. He learned that enslaved men who worked on ships moved between worlds in ways that field hands never could. They saw things. They heard things. They understood that the Atlantic Ocean didn't care about South Carolina law. On December 24, 1856, when Robert was 17, he married Hannah Jones in Charleston. Hannah was an enslaved hotel maid, 5 years older than Robert, owned by a man named Samuel Kingman. Legally, enslaved people were forbidden from marrying. Most slaveholders allowed unofficial weddings anyway, calculating that slaves with families were less likely to run. Robert and Hannah's marriage required permission and payment. Robert agreed to pay Kingman $5 every month for the privilege of living with his own wife. Think about that arithmetic for a moment. Out of the $1 per week Robert was allowed to keep from his own wages, more than half went right back to another white man for the right to sleep next to the woman he loved. In February 1858, Hannah gave birth to their daughter Elizabeth Lydia Smalls. 3 years later, they had a son, Robert Jr. Now, Robert wasn't just thinking about his own freedom. He was thinking about his wife's freedom, his children's freedom, the future of people who hadn't even been born yet. He tried to buy them. He saved everything he could, working every job he could find, trying to accumulate enough money to purchase his own family. Hannah's owner demanded $800. At the rate Robert was going, saving scraps from scraps, it would take him years. And there was no guarantee that Kingman wouldn't change his mind, raise the price, sell Hannah and the children before Robert could gather the money. This was the mathematics of slavery, the way it turned love into leverage, turned family into financial instruments. Robert later said he promised Hannah they would one day escape from slavery. Not that he would try, not that he hoped, that they would. Then came April 12, 1861, and everything changed. Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, the first shots of the American Civil War. Robert Smalls was 22 years old, still enslaved, still paying Samuel Kingman $5 a month for the right to live with his wife. In the fall of 1861, Smalls was assigned to work aboard the CSS Planter, a Confederate military transport. The Planter was a sidewheel steamer, 147 feet long, originally built as a cotton vessel, but now repurposed by the Confederacy to carry guns, ammunition, troops, and supplies around Charleston Harbor and beyond. The ship was under the command of Charleston's district commander, Brigadier General Roswell Ripley, and operated with a crew of 3 white officers and 8 enslaved men. The white officers were Captain C.J. Reliea, pilot Samuel Smith, and engineer Zarek Pitcher. The enslaved crew included Robert Smalls, who served as the effective wheelman and pilot, even though he couldn't hold the official title. Robert's skills, honed over years working Charleston's waterways, made him invaluable. He piloted the Planter throughout Charleston Harbor and beyond, along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts. He surveyed waterways, helped lay mines that the Confederacy called torpedoes, and delivered dispatches to forts and military installations. He knew every checkpoint, every signal, every routine. He knew which forts required which coded whistles to pass safely. He knew the Confederate password system, and from the deck of the Planter, he could see the line of Union blockade ships in the outer harbor, 7 miles away. The United States Navy had surrounded Charleston as a part of President Lincoln's strategy to strangle southern ports. Those ships represented something. They represented the possibility that the United States government might actually win this war, that slavery might actually end, that the Confederacy's entire justification for existing might collapse. But they also represented immediate opportunity. If someone could get past the Confederate checkpoints, past Fort Sumter, past Fort Moultrie, past all the guns pointed at the harbor, they could reach those Union ships. They could be free. Smalls appeared content. He had the confidence of the Planter's white officers, who trusted him enough to routinely leave him and the enslaved crew alone on the ship overnight. This trust was both a compliment to Smalls's skills and a spectacular miscalculation of his intentions. At some point in April 1862, Robert Smalls began to plan an escape. He didn't act alone. He discussed the plan with all the other enslaved men in the crew except one whom he didn't trust. This was how resistance worked under slavery. It required absolute discretion, absolute trust, absolute courage from every single person involved. One informant, one moment of doubt, one person who decided the risk wasn't worth it, and everyone died. The penalty for what Smalls was planning wasn't jail time. It was hanging, or worse. The other enslaved crew members had their own families, their own fears, their own reasons to stay or go. Smalls had to convince them that freedom was possible, that his plan could work, that the promise of reaching those Union ships 7 miles away was worth risking everything. It helped that by early May 1862, the war wasn't going well for the Confederacy. They'd had some victories, sure, but the Union blockade was tightening, and everyone in Charleston could see it. More importantly, Smalls could offer something concrete. He knew the signals. He knew the routines. He knew that if they acted at the right time with the right preparation, they had a chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. And for people who had never had a chance at anything, who had been born into a system designed to ensure they never would, a chance was enough. On May 12, 1862, the planter returned to Charleston after 2 weeks of supplying various Confederate positions. The ship was heavily armed with approximately 200 rounds of ammunition, a 32-pound pivot gun, a 24-pound howitzer, and 4 other guns, including one that had been dented in the original attack on Fort Sumter. This wasn't just a transport ship. This was a significant military asset. That evening, the 3 white officers made a decision that would change American history. They decided to spend the night ashore, either attending a party or visiting family, leaving the 8 enslaved crew members alone on the armed vessel. Captain Reliea could have faced court-martial for this decision if it had been discovered before what happened next. That's how much he trusted his enslaved crew. That's how completely he misunderstood what slavery actually was. After the white officers left, Smalls put the plan into motion. Around 3 in the morning on May 13th, while Charleston slept, the enslaved crew fired up the planter's boilers. They made no unusual noise, nothing that would alert the Confederate guards. Then they quietly slipped the ship away from the wharf at Southern Wharf, just a few hundred yards from General Ripley's headquarters. Their first stop was another wharf where they'd arranged to pick up their families. Hannah Smalls was waiting with Elizabeth and Robert Jr. 5 other women and 3 other children came aboard. 16 people total. 9 men, 5 women, 3 children. Every single one of them enslaved. Every single one of them about to be free or dead. Robert Smalls put on Captain Reliea's wide-brimmed straw hat. This wasn't just practical disguise. It was symbolic armor, a way of literally wearing the authority that slavery said he could never possess. Then he positioned himself in the pilot house and began steering the planter through Confederate-controlled Charleston Harbor. The ship had to pass 5 Confederate forts and checkpoints before reaching open water: Fort Johnson, Fort Ripley, Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, the floating battery. At each one, sentries watched for any unusual activity. At each one, Confederate soldiers manned guns that could blow the planter out of the water if they suspected anything wrong. Smalls had one advantage. He knew the signals. The planter approached Fort Johnson. Smalls pulled the whistle cord, sounding the required signal. The fort's sentries, seeing what appeared to be the planter on a routine early morning mission, let them pass. Fort Ripley. Same procedure, the correct whistle pattern, a wave from the pilot house, the assumption that the captain was at the helm where he belonged. Then came Fort Sumter, the most dangerous checkpoint. This was where the Civil War had started just over a year earlier. This was the symbolic heart of Confederate Charleston, the fortress that guarded the harbor entrance. Smalls had delivered supplies here many times before. He knew the routine. He knew the signals. He also knew that if anyone looked closely enough, if anyone decided to send someone aboard to check on the cargo or verify the captain's orders, 16 people were about to die. The planter pulled close to Fort Sumter. Smalls stood in the pilot house, silhouetted by the early morning light, wearing the captain's hat pulled low. He gave the correct signal whistle. The Confederate sentries at Fort Sumter, recognizing the planter and seeing no reason for concern, let them pass. Fort Moultrie, another checkpoint, another signal. Another moment where everything could collapse. The sentries waved them through, then open water. For the first time in their lives, 16 enslaved people were beyond Confederate guns. But they weren't free yet. Not quite. They were in the waters between Confederate positions and the Union blockade, a no-man's land where any ship could be fired upon by either side. The Union blockade squadron couldn't see inside the planter. They couldn't know that this Confederate transport ship heading toward them wasn't a threat but a prize. They had their guns trained on the approaching vessel, ready to blow it apart. Someone on the planter quickly found a white bedsheet. They hoisted it up as a makeshift flag of surrender, just as the Union ship USS Onward was preparing to fire. The Onward's crew, confused but alert, watched as the planter drew closer. Then Robert Smalls, still wearing the captain's hat, called out to the Union ship's captain. What he said in that moment has been recorded in multiple sources, and it captures everything about who Robert Smalls was and what he'd just accomplished. He said, "Good morning, sir. I've brought you some of the old United States guns, sir, that were for Fort Sumter." The crew of the planter erupted. Some men started jumping and dancing. Others cursed Fort Sumter, the fortress they'd just passed under false signals. All 16 people, for the first time in their lives, were free. Not by permission, not by purchase, not by gradual manumission or someone's will upon death. Free because they'd taken freedom, because they'd risked everything and won. The Union Navy immediately recognized what Smalls had delivered. The planter wasn't just a symbolic victory. It was a military intelligence bonanza. The ship carried valuable guns, ammunition, Confederate signal codes, and detailed information about Charleston's defenses. More importantly, Robert Smalls himself carried something even more valuable in his head. He knew Charleston Harbor better than almost anyone. He knew where the Confederates had laid their mines. He knew which fortifications were undermanned. He knew troop movements and defense positions. Flag Officer Samuel Francis DuPont, commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron at Port Royal, interviewed Smalls personally. He was impressed enough to write to the Navy Secretary in Washington that Robert was superior to any contraband who had come into Union lines, and that he was remarkably intelligent. Smalls told DuPont something the Union Navy didn't know. The Confederates were abandoning their fortifications at Coles Island on Charleston's southern flank. Acting on this intelligence, Union forces captured Coles Island and its string of batteries without a fight on May 20th, just 1 week after Smalls's escape. The Union would hold the Stono Inlet as a base for the remaining 3 years of the war. This wasn't just a daring escape. This was military strategy delivered by someone the Confederacy considered property. News of Smalls's exploit spread rapidly through the North. Northern newspapers celebrated him as a hero. Harper's Weekly published illustrations of the escape. The story had everything white Northern audiences wanted. A brave enslaved man outwitting his masters, a dramatic nighttime escape, a valuable military prize delivered to Union forces. But there was something deeper happening here. Something that made white Northerners uncomfortable even as they celebrated Smalls. He'd proven something they'd spent decades denying. He'd proven that enslaved people weren't content, that they were capable of sophisticated planning and execution, that they understood military strategy and could operate complex machinery, that they were, in short, exactly as human and capable as white people, and that slavery was maintained not by black incapacity, but by white violence. The Confederacy put a $4,000 bounty on Robert Smalls's head. Southern newspapers didn't quite know how to process what had happened. Some claimed, despite all evidence, that white people must have been aboard to help the enslaved crew escape. One Confederate aide-de-camp even suggested that 2 white men and a white woman had secretly boarded the ship and escaped with it. This interpretation was necessary for white Southerners because the alternative was acknowledging that enslaved people could plan and execute something this sophisticated entirely on their own, which would undermine the entire intellectual foundation of slavery. The facts, as Mark Twain wrote, are stubborn things. There was no record of any white passengers aboard the Planter on the morning of May 13th. Robert Smalls and his crew had acted alone. Congress passed a bill on May 30th, 1862, authorizing the Navy to appraise the Planter and award Smalls and his crew half the proceeds for rescuing the ship from the enemies of the government. The ship was valued at considerably more than $4,000. Smalls personally received $1,500, enough money to purchase his former owner's house in Beaufort after the war, though according to later Navy records his pay should have been substantially higher. Still, $1,500 was more than enough to matter. Robert Smalls, who'd spent years trying to save $800 to buy his wife's freedom, now had that money and more. More importantly, he didn't need to buy anyone's freedom because he'd stolen it. But Smalls didn't stop with escape. He traveled to Washington and met with President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. At this point in the war, Lincoln was still refusing to allow black men to serve as soldiers in the Union Army. The official position was that this was a white man's war to preserve the Union, not a war to end slavery. Smalls told them otherwise. He told them that black men were ready to fight, that they understood what this war meant, that they had the skills and courage to serve. He was living proof. After this meeting and Smalls's personal advocacy, the policy changed. Stanton ordered 5,000 formerly enslaved people to enlist and fight for the Union. Smalls was later credited with recruiting 5,000 soldiers by himself through his efforts. The Planter was repaired, refitted, and put into Union service. Smalls was initially employed as a civilian pilot, then transferred to the Army in March 1863. By his own account, he was present at 17 major battles and engagements during the Civil War. He piloted multiple ships including the Crusader, the Planter again after it returned to service, the Huron, and the Paul Jones. In April 1863, He was piloting the ironclad USS Keokuk during the Union's bombardment of Fort Sumter. The Keokuk took heavy fire, was badly damaged, and eventually sank. Smalls was injured but survived. His courage under fire was noted by multiple Union commanders. Then came an incident in December 1863 that revealed exactly who Robert Smalls was. He was piloting the Planter under Captain James Nickerson on Folly Island Creek when Confederate batteries opened fire from Secessionville. Captain Nickerson, a white officer, fled the pilot house and hid in the coal bunker. Nickerson abandoned his post under fire, leaving the ship without a commander. Robert Smalls, who wasn't officially the captain and couldn't legally hold that rank, refused to surrender. He knew that if the Confederates captured the ship, the black crewmen wouldn't be treated as prisoners of war. They would be summarily executed, or worse, sold back into slavery as punishment. Smalls entered the pilot house and took command. He piloted the Planter to safety through Confederate fire. For this action, he was promoted to captain, making him the first black man to command a vessel in United States Navy service. His monthly pay was set at $150, making him one of the highest-paid black soldiers of the war. While Smalls was serving in the war, he was also fighting another battle in Philadelphia. In December 1864, the Planter was in Philadelphia for repairs and refitting. Smalls, now a decorated Union war hero, boarded a streetcar to traverse the city. He was ordered to give his seat to a white passenger and told to ride on the open overflow platform. Robert Smalls, who had stolen a Confederate warship, who had commanded Union vessels in battle, who had been injured in combat for the United States, refused to be treated as less than human in a northern city. He left the streetcar rather than submit to segregation. This incident became public. The idea that a heroic veteran was being humiliated on public transportation in a northern city outraged enough people that Pennsylvania's legislature passed a bill in 1867 integrating public transportation throughout the state. This was one of America's first successful mass boycotts of segregated transportation, led by Robert Smalls more than 80 years before Rosa Parks. On April 14, 1865, the Civil War effectively ended. Robert Smalls piloted the Planter back to Charleston Harbor for a ceremony at Fort Sumter, the same fort he'd passed under false signals 3 years earlier. They raised the American flag over the site where the war had begun. Smalls was there to witness it. The war was over, slavery was over, the Confederacy was destroyed, and Robert Smalls, who'd been born in a slave cabin behind Henry McKee's house, was a free man, a war hero, and about to become something else entirely. He was about to become a politician. Smalls returned to Beaufort in 1865. Using his prize money from the Planter's capture, he purchased the McKee house at 511 Prince Street, the same house where he'd been born behind the slave cabin, the same house where his mother had worked as Henry McKee's property. The purchase happened at a tax auction. The Union had seized properties belonging to white residents who'd fled when Beaufort fell into federal hands in 1861. The symbolism was perfect. Robert Smalls, formerly enslaved by the McKee family, now owned their house. He lived there. His mother Lydia lived with him for the remainder of her life. And in an act of grace that says something important about who Smalls was, when Jane McKee, Henry's widow, fell ill with nowhere to go, Smalls allowed her to live in what had been her house until her death. Think about that decision. Smalls could have refused. He would have been justified in refusing. This was the woman who had legally owned him and his mother, who had profited from their labor, who had participated in a system designed to dehumanize them. but Smalls let her stay. Not because he owed her anything, not because he forgot what slavery was, but because he understood something about freedom that people who had never been enslaved sometimes missed. Freedom meant having the power to choose grace rather than revenge. It meant exercising humanity that the slaveholding class had insisted black people didn't possess. Smalls couldn't read or write when the Civil War ended. He was 26 years old, a war hero and celebrity, but illiterate. He spent 9 months learning, studying with a teacher in Philadelphia and later in South Carolina. He didn't see literacy as optional. He understood that Reconstruction would require black political participation, and that political participation would require education. In 1866, he went into business with Richard Howell Gleaves, a black businessman from Philadelphia. They opened a store in Beaufort to serve the needs of freedmen. Smalls also purchased a 2-story building and converted it into a school for black children. He understood that freedom without education was incomplete, that the next generation needed tools he'd never had. In 1868, South Carolina held a constitutional convention to write a new state constitution under congressional Reconstruction. Robert Smalls was elected as a delegate. This convention was unlike anything South Carolina had ever seen. Black men sat alongside white men, debating the fundamental law of the state. Smalls lobbied hard for public education to be guaranteed in the Constitution. He wanted compulsory, free schooling available to all South Carolina children, black and white. The idea was revolutionary for a state that had made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. The convention succeeded, and the 1868 Constitution included provisions for public education that wouldn't have existed without Smalls's advocacy. Later that year, Smalls was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. He served from 1868 to 1870, introducing legislation including a Homestead Act and a Civil Rights Bill. He worked to assist poor people regardless of race, pushing for practical reforms that would make Reconstruction actually mean something in people's daily lives. In 1870, he was elected to the South Carolina Senate, serving until 1874. He chaired the printing committee and continued his work on education and internal improvements. He helped found the Enterprise Railroad in 1870, an 18-mile horse-drawn railway line that carried cargo and passengers between Charleston's wharves and inland depots. The railroad's board of directors was almost entirely black. This was black entrepreneurship and political power working together, exactly what white Southerners feared most about Reconstruction. In 1872, Smalls started publishing a newspaper, the Beaufort Southern Standard. He understood that political power required communication, that black communities needed their own sources of information and advocacy. He attended the Republican National Convention in 1872 as a delegate, the first of 7 conventions he would attend over his political career. His wartime fame, his fluency in the Gula dialect spoken throughout South Carolina's Sea Islands, and his genuine commitment to his constituents made him enormously popular. He was a natural politician not because he compromised his principles, but because he understood power and how to use it. In 1874, South Carolina created a new congressional district where 68% of the population was black. This was Robert Smalls's opportunity. He ran for the United States House of Representatives and won with nearly 80% of the vote. On March 4, 1875, Robert Smalls, who had been born enslaved, who had been legally considered 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional apportionment, took his seat as a member of Congress. He was 35 years old. He'd been legally free for only 13 years. Smalls's first term was remarkably productive, considering Democrats controlled the House. He obtained appropriations to improve Port Royal Harbor, crucial for his coastal constituents. He sought compensation for the federal government's use of the Citadel, Charleston's military academy since 1865. He worked on internal improvements throughout his district. In June 1876, he introduced an amendment to a U.S. Army reorganization bill that would have desegregated Army regiments. It failed, but Smalls made his position clear. He opposed the transfer of federal troops out of the South, understanding exactly what would happen to black Southerners once military protection was withdrawn. He warned Congress about the red shirts, white paramilitary groups backing the Democratic Party's efforts to violently reclaim political control. He was right to warn them. The 1876 election was chaos. Red shirt violence and voter intimidation reached levels that shocked even people who'd seen the worst of Reconstruction's failures. Smalls won re-election, but barely, and only through enormous courage on the part of black voters who risked their lives to cast ballots. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. Federal troops withdrew from the South. The experiment in multiracial democracy, brief and imperfect as it was, collapsed under the weight of white supremacist violence that the federal government no longer had the will to resist. In October 1877, while Smalls was preparing for his second term, South Carolina's Democratic state government charged him with accepting a $5,000 bribe while chairing the printing committee in the state Senate. The timing was not coincidental. Democrats were systematically targeting black Republicans, using the legal system as a weapon to destroy black political power. Smalls was arrested in Beaufort and taken to Columbia. After a trial that ran from November 7th to 11, he was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Republican newspapers across the North cried foul, accusing Democrats of targeting the hero of the planter because of his success as a black representative. The case against him was transparently political. On April 23, 1879, South Carolina's Democratic governor pardoned Smalls as part of an agreement where charges were also dropped against Democrats accused of election fraud. Everyone understood what this was. It was a trade, a cynical political bargain that let both sides save face while acknowledging that Reconstruction's rules no longer applied. The conviction and scandal took a political toll. In 1878, Smalls lost his re-election bid to Democrat George Tillman, brother of the notorious white supremacist Ben Tillman. Political times, as one observer noted, were simply frightful. Men were shot at, hounded down, trapped, and held until certain meetings were over, and intimidated in every possible way. Black voters who tried to cast ballots for Smalls faced violence, or the threat of violence, or the certain knowledge that voting Republican could cost them their jobs, their homes, their lives. Despite receiving a majority of black votes in the district, Smalls couldn't overcome the Democratic wave backed by paramilitary terror. Tillman won with 71% of the vote, a number that tells you everything about how those votes were obtained. Smalls ran again in 1880 and lost narrowly. But he successfully contested the election results, proving that intimidation and fraud had prevented a fair vote. The House Committee on Elections investigated and found that Smalls's supporters had been frightened away from polls throughout the district. In June 1882, the committee reported in favor of Smalls. House Democrats tried to prevent him from taking his seat by deserting the chamber to avoid a quorum when his case came to a vote on July 19, 1882. Their plan backfired. The House voted to seat him anyway. 141-5 with 144 abstentions. Robert Smalls returned to Congress. During his short term in the 47th Congress, Smalls became the second black representative to preside over debate in the House when Speaker J. Warren Keifer called him to the rostrum on January 11, 1883, during debate on a bill regulating American shipping. It was a symbolic moment, a black man born into slavery presiding over debates in the chamber where the Fugitive Slave Act had once been law. In 1884, Smalls was elected to fill a vacancy in a different district and won re-election that year. He served from 1884 to 1887, his final term in Congress. Throughout his congressional career, Smalls fought for civil rights legislation. He introduced an amendment prohibiting denial of service based on race or color in the District of Columbia's restaurants and eating facilities. The House approved his amendment, but the bill died in the Senate. He worked to prevent voter disfranchisement, warned against the withdrawal of federal protection for black citizens, and advocated for equal treatment under law. By the late 1880s, white Democrats had effectively reclaimed control throughout the South. The mechanisms they used varied by state: literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses. But the goal was always the same. They wanted to eliminate black political participation entirely while maintaining a veneer of legal legitimacy. In 1895, South Carolina held a constitutional convention to formalize this goal. Robert Smalls was one of 6 black delegates in attendance. He was 56 years old, a former congressman, a war hero, a man who had spent 3 decades fighting for civil rights. He went to this convention knowing he would lose. But he went anyway because some battles have to be fought even when you know the outcome. The convention was called explicitly to disfranchise black voters. Governor and later Senator Benjamin Tillman, the same family that had defeated Smalls in 1878, led the effort. The proposed constitution included literacy tests, understanding clauses, and other requirements that would be enforced selectively to exclude black voters while permitting illiterate white voters to continue voting. Smalls and the other black delegates knew exactly what this was. They'd lived through Reconstruction. They'd seen how white Southerners responded to black political power. They knew that legal fig leaves wouldn't change the fundamental goal of white supremacy. Robert Smalls gave a speech at that convention that deserves to be remembered. He reminded the delegates that since Reconstruction, 53,000 black people had been killed in the South, and not more than 3 white men had been convicted and hung for these crimes. He pointed out that black people in South Carolina were paying taxes on $12.5 million worth of property. He challenged the convention to pass a simple, honest educational and property requirement if they truly believed black people were unfit to vote. He knew they wouldn't, because such a requirement would disfranchise thousands of white voters. He called out the infamous 8-box law, which required poorly educated voters to correctly place ballots in 8 separate boxes for different offices, a system designed to confuse and exclude. He warned that the North was watching, that history would judge this convention harshly. Smalls proposed his own amendments. When the convention included provisions against interracial marriage, Smalls proposed adding that any white person who lived and cohabited with a black person should be disqualified from holding office, and that children of such relationships should bear the father's name. The amendment was voted down by the largest margin recorded at the convention. White delegates had no problem prohibiting black men from marrying white women, but couldn't accept provisions that would hold white men accountable for relationships with black women. The hypocrisy was perfect and complete. Smalls also proposed a straightforward voting requirement, universal suffrage with fair application of any educational standards. It was voted down. Everything the black delegates proposed was voted down, usually without serious debate, because this convention had been called for one purpose and one purpose only. The black delegates, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, tried to publicize what was happening. They wrote an article for the New York World explaining that the convention's registration officers would have sole power to make voters in South Carolina, with no appeal to any court of law. They explained that the convention had been called to legalize the frauds perpetrated on the elective franchise since 1876. They understood they couldn't win in the convention hall, so they tried to win in the court of national opinion. It didn't matter. The new Constitution was adopted. For decades afterward, this Constitution survived legal challenges, resulting in both the exclusion of black people from political participation and the crippling of the Republican Party throughout South Carolina. At one point during the convention, someone proposed that members who didn't sign the final Constitution shouldn't be paid. Robert Smalls said he would walk home rather than sign the instrument. He meant it literally. He would walk from Columbia to Beaufort before he would sign his name to a document designed to destroy black voting rights. The resolution wasn't pressed, and Smalls didn't have to make that walk, but his position was clear. Some compromises aren't compromises. Some documents don't deserve signatures. After leaving Congress in 1887, Smalls didn't disappear from public life. In 1890, President Benjamin Harrison appointed him as collector of the Port of Beaufort, a federal position he held until 1913, with only a brief break during Democrat Grover Cleveland's second term. It was a patronage position, sure, but it also represented something. A black man held significant federal authority in a southern port town through the height of Jim Crow. White residents resented it. They had to do business with him, had to acknowledge his authority, had to reckon with the fact that Robert Smalls still mattered. Smalls continued to attend Republican national conventions. He remained active in South Carolina Republican politics even as the party withered under Democratic oppression. In 1912, at age 73, he wrote a letter expressing anxiety over the upcoming presidential election. He asked that every black man in the North who had a vote to cast would cast that vote for the regular Republican Party, and thus bury the Democratic Party so deep that there will not be seen even a bubble coming from the spot where the burial took place. He never stopped fighting. He never stopped believing that the fight mattered. Robert Smalls died on February 23, 1915, in Beaufort. He was 75 years old. He died in the same house where he'd been born enslaved, the house he'd purchased from his former owner's estate, the house where he'd raised his children, and where he'd allowed his former enslaver to live out her final days. He died of malaria and diabetes after a life that spanned one of the most transformative and tragic periods in American history. He was buried in the churchyard of Tabernacle Baptist Church in downtown Beaufort. The monument on his grave is inscribed with words he spoke to the South Carolina legislature in 1895. My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life. Robert Smalls's story is extraordinary, but it shouldn't be extraordinary. What he proved in Charleston Harbor on May 13, 1862, what he proved through 5 terms in Congress, what he proved at the 1895 Constitutional Convention, was simply that enslaved people were human beings with intelligence, courage, dignity, and capacity equal to anyone. That shouldn't have required proof. That should have been self-evident. But America built an entire economic and social system on denying it, and then spent another century after slavery's formal end continuing to deny it through Jim Crow, segregation, disfranchisement, and violence. When we talk about Reconstruction's failure, we often frame it as a political problem, a failure of Northern will or a victory of Southern intransigence. But Robert Smalls's life shows us something more precise. Reconstruction didn't fail because it was impossible. It failed because white Southerners, and eventually white Northerners, chose to let it fail. They chose violence over justice. They chose white supremacy over multiracial democracy. They chose mythology over history. The 1895 South Carolina Constitution that Smalls opposed remained in effect in various forms well into the 20th century. The disfranchisement provisions he spoke against became the model for similar provisions throughout the South. The white supremacist politics he fought against became the Democratic Party's foundation in the region for generations. But here's what the white supremacists couldn't destroy. They couldn't destroy what Robert Smalls had proven. They could suppress black voting through violence and legal manipulation. They could write black people out of the political system. They could create an entire historical mythology, the lost cause, that pretended the Civil War wasn't about slavery and Reconstruction was a terrible mistake. But they couldn't unwrite what happened in Charleston Harbor on May 13, 1862. They couldn't make Robert Smalls less intelligent, less courageous, less capable. They couldn't change the fact that he'd commanded Union vessels in battle, served in Congress, and fought for civil rights with every tool available to him. The truth remained the truth regardless of who tried to bury it. For much of the 20th century, Robert Smalls's story was largely forgotten outside South Carolina. The rise of lost cause mythology after Reconstruction deliberately erased black heroes from mainstream historical narratives. School textbooks didn't mention him. National parks didn't commemorate him. The average American had no idea who he was or what he'd done. This erasure was intentional. Smalls's story undermined every piece of propaganda white supremacists constructed about slavery, about black capacity, about Reconstruction. So they simply stopped telling it. That's changing now, slowly. In 2007, the U.S. Army commissioned the USAV Major General Robert Smalls, the first Army ship named for an African American. In 2017, President Barack Obama established Reconstruction-era National Monument in Beaufort County, later renamed Reconstruction-era National Historical Park, with Robert Smalls's home and story as central elements. In 2023, South Carolina began celebrating Robert Smalls Day every May 13th, the anniversary of his escape. In 2024, the South Carolina legislature passed a bill to erect a monument to Smalls on the State House grounds. These recognitions matter not because they change what happened, but because they acknowledge what's always been true. Robert Smalls lived through American slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the rise of Jim Crow. He was born when enslaved people legally couldn't marry, couldn't read, couldn't own property, couldn't testify in court, couldn't do anything that acknowledged their humanity. He died in a South that had reimposed many of those restrictions through different mechanisms. In between, for a brief moment during Reconstruction, he helped prove what multiracial democracy could look like. He showed that black political leadership wasn't just possible, but effective. He demonstrated that the capabilities white supremacists claimed black people lacked were simply being suppressed by white violence and legal oppression. The tragedy of Reconstruction isn't that it tried and failed to create racial justice in the South. The tragedy is that it succeeded just enough to prove it was possible, and then white supremacists destroyed it anyway. Robert Smalls's congressional career, his business success, his political organizing, his advocacy for education and civil rights, all of it proved that when black people had even minimal protection and opportunity, they flourished. And when that protection was withdrawn, when violence was permitted to suppress black political participation, when the federal government decided that maintaining white Southern cooperation was more important than protecting black Southern lives, then the interracial democracy that Smalls had helped build collapsed. But collapse isn't the same as impossibility. That's what Robert Smalls's life teaches us. The fact that white supremacists won in 1895, that they successfully disfranchised black voters and established Jim Crow, doesn't mean they were right. It means they were willing to use violence and legal oppression to maintain power. And the fact that it took another 70 years, another civil rights movement, another generation of activists risking their lives to begin dismantling what was built in 1895, doesn't mean Smalls's generation failed. It means they fought a battle that required multiple generations to win. When Robert Smalls stood in that Charleston Harbor pilot house wearing the captain's hat at 3 in the morning on May 13, 1862, he was gambling everything on the possibility that freedom was achievable, that slavery could be defeated, that the future could be different from the past. He was right. Slavery was defeated. The Confederacy was destroyed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. For a time, black men voted, held office, participated in democracy. That it didn't last doesn't make it any less real. And the fact that we're still fighting versions of the same battles Smalls fought doesn't mean his life was wasted. It means he was part of a long struggle, and that the struggle continues. Robert Smalls stole a Confederate warship and delivered it to Union forces. He served as a captain in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War. He helped desegregate Philadelphia's public transportation. He served 5 terms in Congress. He purchased his enslaver's house and let his enslaver live there. He fought for public education, civil rights, voting rights, and racial justice for 50 years. He lived to see much of what he fought for destroyed by white supremacist violence and legal oppression. And he died knowing that the truth remained the truth regardless of who tried to bury it. "My race needs no special defense," he said, "for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." That's what Robert Smalls fought for. An equal chance. That's what was denied. That's what his life proved was possible. And that's what makes his story worth remembering.